All right, let's dive into this explainer. Today, we're looking at what has to be one of history's absolute strangest unsolved mysteries. We're exploring a story that sits perfectly on the razor's edge between documented fact, local legend, and, honestly, the totally unknown. It's an investigation that has kept people guessing for nearly 900 years. So, picture the scene. It's 12th century England. This is a time of castles, feudal kings, and, as you can imagine, a whole lot of deep-seated superstitions. People genuinely believed that the thick, dark forest hid ancient secrets, and that strange creatures were just kind of wandering around right past the edge of town. Now, most of these stories were eventually dismissed as just myths. That is, until one totally perfectly ordinary afternoon in a small farming village called Woolpit. The weather was fine, farmers were out working in the fields, business as usual. But then, the impossible quite literally became reality. Section 1, the discovery in Woolpit. Let's get right into this bizarre investigation, starting at the crime scene, so to speak, near an old wolf pit. So, some villagers notice movement near this deep trap that was dug to catch wolves. At first glance, they figure they've just stumbled upon two lost kids, a boy and a girl. They look terrified and super confused. But as the farmers actually walk up to them, they realize something is very, very wrong. It wasn't how they were acting, it was their completely alien appearance. The absolute shocker here? Their skin was completely green, like bright emerald paint green. On top of that, they were wearing these bizarrely cut clothes made from some weird material that nobody in medieval England recognized. And when the villagers tried asking them where they were from, the kids responded in a totally unrecognized language. Weird sounds, strange rhythms, just complete gibberish to the locals. No nearby village was missing kids, and no traveling merchant had ever seen clothes like theirs. They had, for all intents and purposes, appeared out of nowhere. Naturally, the villagers did the decent thing and took these otherworldly kids into their homes. But that instantly created a massive problem. How do you keep them alive? I mean, you put bread, meat, vegetables in front of them, the absolute staples of medieval life, and they wouldn't touch a single bite. They completely refused it all. Days are going by, and these kids are literally starving themselves. But then, out of nowhere, the kids spot a basket of freshly picked green beans. For the first time since they arrived, their faces just light up. They didn't even wait for anyone to cook them. They practically dove in, tearing open the pods and just ravenously eating the raw beans inside. Talk about being picky eaters, right? But seriously, for weeks, this was their entire diet. They survived on absolutely nothing but raw green beans. Moving on to Section 2, the Tale of Twilight. Let's see how this story develops as the children start to assimilate and finally reveal their unbelievable backstory. Watching their journey unfold over the years is actually incredibly fascinating, though pretty tragic too. As the months passed and they slowly learned English word by word, an amazing physical change happened. That shocking emerald tint to their skin, it actually began to fade away entirely until they basically looked just like any other villager. But then, tragedy hits. The young boy becomes gravely ill and passes away, taking his side of the story to the grave. The girl, however, pulls through. She fully assimilates into English society, grows up, and finally starts to share the wild details of where they actually came from. Once she could speak fluently, she told everyone that her homeland was called St. Martin's Land. And guys, her description is wild. She claimed it was this mysterious world where literally everyone had green skin, just like she and her brother originally did. But even creepier, she said there was no actual sun in her homeland. The world was permanently dim, covered in this perpetual twilight, just kind of trapped forever between day and night. So the obvious question is, how did they get to England? They certainly didn't take a boat or a wagon. She outlined this incredibly specific sensory journey. First, she said they were just minding their own business, tending to their father's animals in a field in St. Martin's Land. Next, they suddenly hear this massive ringing noise, echoing loudly like giant church bells. They get curious, so they follow the sound straight into a dark cavern. She said the deeper they walked, the louder these bells got. And then, finally, the darkness just abruptly ends, and they walk out not into their twilight home, but into the glaring daylight right next to that wolf pit in medieval Woolpit. Okay, hearing all that, it sounds like pure fantasy, right? A hidden twilight realm, a magical cave, kids with emerald skin. It is so easy to just write this whole thing off as a local medieval fairy tale made up to entertain people around a fire. But what if there's actual proof this happened? Let's look at Section 3, the historical evidence, because this is the crucial point where the story elevates from a simple myth into a genuinely documented historical anomaly. You see, two highly respected medieval writers actually documented this event. And look at the era here. Both William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall lived in the 12th century, right around the time this supposedly went down. They both wrote about the Green Children in stunning detail, pulling from gathered first-hand stories and actual witness testimony. The fact that they recorded this almost immediately after the event occurred completely changes things. It cements it in the historical record. This wasn't some myth invented hundreds of years later. People at the time were genuinely trying to figure out what to do with these two anomalous kids. Which brings us to Section 4, Scientific and Earthly Theories. Because if this really happened, modern historians and scientists argue there has to be a rational earthly explanation, right? Let's strip away the myth for a second. The first major theory, and the most historically grounded one, is that the children were simply lost Flemish refugees. During the 12th century, that area of Europe was incredibly volatile. There were lots of Flemish communities, settlers from what is now Belgium, living in eastern England, and they were constantly being displaced by violent civil conflicts. If these kids were Flemish orphans, deeply traumatized and separated from their parents during a battle, it totally explains why they wore strange foreign clothes and spoke a language no one knew. To the isolated farmers in Woolpit, a panic-stricken Flemish dialect would have sounded like absolute alien gibberish. Okay, but what about the green skin? Well, scientists point straight to a severe medical condition called chlorosis. It's triggered by intense malnutrition and dietary deficiencies, and it literally causes a person's skin to take on a sickly pale or slightly greenish hue. Think about it. The kids arrived starving and completely refused to eat anything but raw beans, which suggests they had been suffering from starvation long before they stumbled into Woolpit. And perfectly validating this medical theory, once the kids finally started eating a proper, balanced diet, that green color completely faded away. So when you put these two earthly theories side by side, it paints a very compelling, logical picture. The lost refugee theory beautifully wraps up the mystery of the language, the clothes, and the obvious trauma. Meanwhile, the rare medical condition of chlorosis completely demystifies the green skin and why it eventually vanished. When you combine them, they neatly solve almost all the physical clues left in the historical record. But hold on. There is a massive, glaring hole in this logic. If they were just traumatized orphans from a neighboring settlement who happens to be anemic, why on earth would they invent a story about St. Martin's Land? Why would this girl consistently maintain such a wild, highly imaginative lie about an underground world of perpetual twilight for her entire life? She never changed her story. Even well into adulthood, she never once admitted it was just a coping mechanism or a childhood fantasy. And that realization pushes us right into Section 5, Visitors from Another Dimension. Now we're shifting gears to explore the theories where earthly logic kind of hits a brick wall, looking strictly at the unexplainable ideas that have made this mystery world famous. On one hand, you have Theory 3, an underground civilization. European folklore is absolutely packed with ancient tales of hidden communities living deep beneath mountains, entirely cut off from the rest of humanity. But on the other hand, we have Theory 4, an alternate dimension. This proposes that St. Martin's Land wasn't a physical spot on our globe at all, but a parallel reality existing right alongside ours. If that's true, the cave they wandered into wasn't just a tunnel. It acted as an invisible gateway, a literal doorway between two different worlds. Mystery researchers who champion this dimensional theory love to point out the hyper-specific clues in the girl's testimony. Her detailed descriptions of a realm with zero bright sunlight, a place permanently stuck in twilight, and that sudden, jarring transition from pitch darkness directly into a bright medieval English afternoon. It all sounds shockingly like a classic interdimensional crossing. But honestly, the most compelling piece of evidence for these researchers isn't the twilight, it's her unwavering consistency. Over decades, she never once backed down from what she claimed she experienced. Let's wrap things up with Section 6, an enduring historical mystery. As we close out this investigation, we have to ask why this specific event, out of thousands of weird medieval tales, has managed to stick around for nearly 9 centuries. Well, it survives because it's like a giant puzzle where every single theory is missing one crucial piece. The refugee theory gives us a great answer for the language, but completely fails to explain the Twilight story. The medical theory perfectly explains the green skin, but doesn't tell us where their homeland actually was. And the alternate dimension theory covers the cave and the twilight beautifully, but obviously it completely lacks hard scientific evidence. Throw in the fact that the boy tragically died young and the girl eventually assimilated and just vanished into the historical record, and we are left with a puzzle that simply cannot be finished. So we end up right back where we started, staring at the exact same question the villagers of Woolpit asked nearly 1,000 years ago. Who actually were these two lost souls caught between reality and the unknown? Were they just severely traumatized victims of war and malnutrition? Or is there a chance they were truly travelers from a realm just beyond our sight? The truth is, we may never know for sure. And you know what? Perhaps that's exactly where this mystery belongs. Because as we've seen throughout this explainer, as much as we humans crave neat, logical answers, the most fascinating stories in our history are not the ones we easily solve. They're the ones we never can. Thanks so much for joining me today, and as always, keep questioning the unknown.